This movie is about how the mass media, film, TV, and books, how they carry on this lie that the indigenous blacks, aka American Indians, aka African Americans, how they are of mostly an African stock, is the lie that these films and TV shows try to portray in movies such as Roots, in the book that's also called Roots, and in movies like 12 Years a Slave, The Birth of a Nation, and the Book of Negroes, that these are based off of fiction more so than reality, because the people who are identifying themselves as foreigners, which is African American, which is a person that was brought over during the times of slavery from Africa by the Europeans, that category is for foreign blacks, or Negro de Guinea, okay? Not Negro de Terra, meaning the blacks of this land or the indigenous blacks. Now, the reason why I say that is going to be backed up by facts from the United States statistics, okay, which is underneath the United States Library of Congress archival records, which will show and prove exactly how many Africans were actually brought over to the Americas that was enslaved, and how we also are going to explore how the majority of the blacks were indigenous blacks, aka American Indians, Negroes, that were enslaved because they was making war against the European powers that was invading them, that came from Britain, Denmark, France, and Spain. And that these indigenous people, the American Indians, the Negroes, Negro do Terra, the blacks of the land, the indigenous blacks, the American Indians, how they were taken into slavery, and they are actually prisoners of war and not slaves. And also that if your ancestor was a slave, they would not have been on the federal census at all, listed as a free person of color, but that indeed that your ancestor would have been listed on the slave schedule. So let's get into it. Okay, now it says here, Amazing Roots returns after 40 years, dredging up Alex Haley plagiarism scandal. Published by Don Kaplan, New York Daily News, May 19th, 2016 at 2:48 p.m. So this is LeVar, who played as Kuta Kinte in the original 1977 miniseries. And as you see here, he is an American Aborigine. And in another video, I will talk to you about how the American Aborigines, how they are said to look like or look similar to the Aborigines of Australia, the people in Southeast Asia, and also from the west coast of Africa, their phenotypes. Okay, so I will talk about that in another video. But let's get to this. So it says, for all the glory, accolades, and accomplishments, Roots is still deeply rooted in controversy. Alex Haley, the author of the celebrated book, said it was based on his own family history. As we know, that's a lie. But Haley, who died in 1992, was famously accused of plagiarizing parts of the Pulitzer-winning Roots and settled a very public lawsuit brought against him by another writer, Harold Corlander, who was white, wrote a novel called The African in 1967. The book had a similar story of a slave's capture in Africa, his horrific experience as cargo on a ship, and his struggle to hold on to his native culture in a harsh new world. While there are major differences between the two books, Corlander and several expert witnesses testified that Haley had used the African as source material, both for his 1976 book and the 1977 TV miniseries, which was seen by about 140 million viewers. Kurlander sued Haley in 1977 for copyright infringement, Without the African, Roots would have been a very different and very less successful novel, the suit alleged. Indeed, it is doubtful that Mr. Haley could have written Roots without the African. Mr. Haley copied language, thoughts, attitudes, incidents, situations, plot, and character. The trial lasted 5 years in New York Federal District Court. Literary experts testified, including Columbia English professor Michael Wood. The evidence of copying from the African in both the novel and the television uh, dramatization of Roots is clear and irrefutable, was said in court. Haley, who died in 1992, said he did not plagiarize, but he admitted that some sections of Roots appeared to have originally appeared in the African. He settled the case out of court for $650,000, which is 2.4 million in 2016 dollars, and issued a statement. Alex Haley acknowledges and regrets the various materials from the African by Harold Corlander found their way into his book Roots. Okay. All right. So that tells you right there that that story was fiction, based off of fiction. But yet, the American Aborigines believed it because of the imagery of the people and the fact that, Aborigines of America look a lot like the Aborigines of Africa. Now, let's look at this article that's from the website The Conversation, Academic Rigor and Journalistic Flair. And this article is underneath Politics plus Society. That's the category. And it's called American Slavery Separating Fact from Myth. Published June 19, 2017 at 6:40 a.m. The author is Dinah Rami Berry, I think, Associate Professor of History and African Diasporial Studies, University of Texas at Austin. Okay. Now, let's see here what it says. It says people think they know everything about slavery in the United States, but they don't. They think the majority of African slaves came to the American colonies, but they didn't. They talk about 400 years of slavery, but it wasn't. They claim all Southerners owned slaves, but they didn't. Some argue it was all a long time ago, but it wasn't. Slavery had been in the news a lot lately, from the discovery of the auction of 272 enslaved people that enabled Georgetown University to remain in operation, to the McGraw-Hill textbook controversy over calling slaves workers from Africa, and the slavery memorial being built at the University of Virginia. Americans are having conversations about this difficult period in American history. Some of these dialogues have been wrought with controversy and conflict, like the University of Tennessee student who challenged a professor's understanding of enslaved families. As a scholar of slavery at the University of Texas at Austin, I welcome the public debates and connections the American people are making with history. However, there are still many misconceptions about slavery, as evidenced by the conflict at the University of Tennessee. I've spent my career dispelling myths about the particular institution. The goal in my courses is not to victimize one group and celebrate another. Instead, we trace the history of slavery in all its forms to make sense of the origins of wealth inequality and the roots of discrimination today. The history of slavery provides vital context to the contemporary conversations and counters the distorted facts, internet hoaxes, and poor scholarship I caution my students against. Now, for one of the myths that we will talk about is going to be myth one. And this one here is, it says the majority of African slaves came to what became the United States. It says the truth is a little more than 300,000 captives, or 4 to 6%, came to the United States. The majority of enslaved Africans went to Brazil, followed by the Caribbean. A significant number of enslaved Africans arrived in the American colonies by way of the Caribbean, whereas where they were seasoned and mentored into slave life, they spent months or years recovering from the harsh realities of the Middle Passage. Once they were forcefully accustomed to slave labor, many were then brought to the plantations on American soil. Another myth is that slavery lasted for 400 years. Okay, so that's a myth about the transatlantic slave trade. Um, and it said here, so slavery was not unique to the United States. It was a part of every nation's history. Okay. It says all Southerners owned slaves. That's a myth. It says the truth was roughly about 25% of all Southerners owned slaves. The fact that 1/4 of the Southern population were slaveholders is still shocking to many. This truth brings historical insight to modern conversations about inequality and reparations. Okay. It says myth 4, slavery was a long time ago. African Americans have been free in this country for less time than they were enslaved. Do the math, blacks have been free for 152 years, which means that most Americans are only 2 to 3 generations away from slavery. So when they say blacks, they're talking about people that are considered as African Americans who would have been foreign to the American continent because they were stolen away from the continent of Africa. So they would have been considered uh, as Negro de Guinea, which was what the Spanish had called the Africans that they had kidnapped from Africa and were brought to the Americas. Okay, the Spaniards. That's what they called the Africans that they brought over here. Um, and who also was bringing the Africans over were the Dutch East Company, the East India Company was bringing them over here. But before that though, you had the situation of American Indian slavery, where the American Indians were referred to as Negro de Terra, which means the blacks of the land. Okay, and so what I will be showing you now is going to be some clips about the slave schedule and how to find your ancestors on a slave schedule, and that slaves are on a slave schedule, and that free ancestors, whether if they were Indian or African, they would have been found. I mean, the free ones would have been found on the federal census, but any person that was enslaved would be on a slave schedule. Okay. And more than likely, if your ancestor was a free um, Negro or colored or mulatto, more than likely they probably was an Indian, especially during the time of slavery, because a lot of African people, if they were enslaved, slaves weren't able to own property, so they couldn't have been listed as a farmer, and they wouldn't have been listed with their wife or their husband. And back then, they had listed the head of household a lot of the times, which was the male. And he would say, or he would write down, his name, his wife's name, the names of his kids would be written down on the census, along with, the fact that he had owned or rented the land. In a lot of cases, they owned the land, they owned a farm. Okay, so that's the big difference is that African people, they were in bondage and they wasn't obviously allowed to own property. So and then another thing on top of that is a free person of color or a free Negro during the time of slavery, before slavery was abolished. Slavery was allegedly abolished in the United States in 1865. Okay. But slavery actually began around the 15th century when Columbus had came over here. And basically when the Catholic Church had gave permission for them to come over here and to get whatever it was that they felt like they was looking for, whatever type of riches it was that they thought they was going to get, whether if it was gold, silver, you know, slaves, what have you.
You see the Capitol behind me? At the Library of Congress. Look at behind me. It's hard for me to. But anyways, I was in here doing some research and came across some of the numbers from so-called slave trade. And I'm telling y'all, those numbers are way off. So they're trying to say that like 500 people were smushed on ships, but a lot of these ships, they got have records of just one person on them. They'll say like one Negro girl, one Negro boy, or like 5-10 people on it. So, and then a lot of the ships are coming from Barbados, not Guinea or anywhere else like that. So that's something else. Hope y'all can hear me all this wind. That's something else that's a little fishy.
I'm back. Welcome to my channel. This is Kimberly Purpose. Hello, family. Today I wanted to do another video about tracing your roots, as African Americans, the Aborigines, American Aborigines. I find that is very important to trace your root. And I want to talk about this particular article that I found, which was quite interesting. But I also want to talk about how important it is to learn from your elders. I mentioned that in another video, but I can't help but reiterate over and over again that it's very important to talk to the elders in your family and get as much information you can possibly get about your family roots. And that's how I was able to find a lot of the information that I have on my family. On my mom's side, they were very proactive. A lot of them, whenever we did family reunions, they put together books with that they give out to every family member. You could purchase it, and it had like a record of our whole entire family tree, including the U.S. Census, copies of that, copies of our family members, the year they were born, when they were deceased, where were they buried. All that information was included in a book, in a family tree book, which I think is awesome. My mom's side of the family is on point. That's how I could find, that, she could possibly been, oh, I'm sorry, take that off. But that one of my family members was possibly listed on the Dawes Roll. The name was listed, but we weren't sure if it's her or not. But, that was a lot of identity theft going on among the Aborigines. It's possible that your relative could have been listed on a Dawes Roll, but wasn't allowed to move forward because they were considered Negro. And what happened was a lot of the Caucasian settlers were able to take their place and still literally their identity, and be able to put their names in place of the relatives. So dates and date of birth and all that might be a little off because, if someone else took your family member's identity, it's easy to do. But I'm getting off on another topic. Let me get back on topic. But what I was saying was about learning from your elders is very important. I know, I noticed too, there's a difference in generations, because I know my grandmother, she came around, she was born right before the Great Depressions. She, right at the very beginning of the turn of the 19th century. No, not 19th century, 20th century. So, she was able to tell me about the Dawes Commission and everything in the 1920s because she was a little girl during that time period. And she was able to tell me about it because she heard about it from other people. But when I try to talk to my mother about it, who's a baby boomer, she don't like talking about it. She keep on insisting that she is black, and she refused or act like she don't want to accept the fact that we are indigenous to this land. Like my grandmother, she told us all we were Indian, but my mother and a lot of the baby boomers I know are not as accepting. I'm not sure if it's a generational thing or it could be the indoctrination that's going on. But like that example, if you want to see the video, I did this video about essential, I believe the Aboriginal Identity Crisis, one of the series I've done. I talked about the stories that my grandma shared about our family tree and how I was able to connect to a lot of things. And I also want to share a story about my grandfather and how I talked to him. Sometimes some stories may be totally off I don't know, off the beaten path, or just don't make no sense to you at the time when you listen to it. But you should listen to everything your elders say and, keep jot it down, remember it, because every piece of information is very important. And like when my grandfather told me about his grandmother, I thought it was the stupidest story. No, I wouldn't say stupid. It's just, I didn't get much information out of him. I said, Granddad, don't you know anything about our family history? He would always tell me, Kim, I only know one thing. Grandma Suki. Grandma Suki had black children. She had black children, yellow children, and red children. And I come from a black stock. And that's all I know is about Grandma Suki. And when he told me that, I just was so frustrated. He'll tell me that same story over and over again about Grandma Suki. And I went, why is he telling me all this about Grandma Suki? I said, and he wouldn't tell me nothing else. And so I thought it was just a stupid tale, or it wasn't that important, until one day I decided to research the name Suki. And when I looked up Suki, that's when I learned that Suki is an Indian name. And what it means is an abbreviated name for an Indian name. It was abbreviated, it was a shortened name for Susana. I said, wow. So Susana is an Indian name and it means morning. So I learned something. And I said, wow. So at the time when I listened to my grandfather's story, Grandpa Eddie, I thought that, he was just babbling and babbling, but what he told me makes a lot of sense. And it lines up with all the stuff that was going on. And I actually got a first name. So listen to what your elders are telling you. I know the stories may not make sense to you at the time, but if you listen to it, maybe in the future while you're doing some research, it'll spark a light bulb, or you have an aha moment as to exactly what they were telling you. It may not make sense at that particular time, but when you do your research, you start to realize, hey, this is very important information. But anyway, I can go on and on about that. But like I said that's very important, is listening to your elders, getting names and everything. I just wanted to mention that. But this article is called Tracing Your African American Ancestors, and this is by Leslie Hubbard. I thought this was a really good article, and it's very short and straight to the point, which I think is great. I'm going to put a link to this article, and she gives some tips on what you can do to trace your ancestors as well. Like I said, number one is talking to your elders, getting stories, getting names. Those are very important. But this article goes on and says, since February is Black History Month, it is a great time to look at some of the resources available to trace African American ancestors. And if you have African American ancestors, it's a great time to start finding them. Particularly as you work through the Civil War and in the early periods, locating African American roots can be challenging. The good news is that there are some fabulous resources that are becoming more essential all the time. Post 1870 post through 1870s research. If you're tracing African American ancestors and records after 1870, your research path looks similar to the research path of any U.S.-based family line. To begin this research, start with yourself and your immediate family and work back using standard U.S. records, such as censuses and vital and land records. You can use Family Search Online U.S. Research Guide, which includes a clickable map of the United States that directs you to research information for each state. I thought this was quite interesting. I didn't get a chance to check this out, but I'm going to click on it later. I just want to go through this article. I think that, that would be excellent if that does take you to some more resources. But let's continue. The transitional periods. For many people tracing African American roots, the periods during and right after the Civil War is key to research. In 1860, there are nearly 4 million enslaved individuals living in the United States, representing just under 13% of the population. They were considered property and were not included by names in most records before the emancipation in 1863. By following your ancestors closely to the records back through the Civil War and the aftermath, you can often see clues that leads to finding them in earlier records. And that's true, but I also want to point it out. I did another video about the Indian Wars, I believe it was the Creek Wars. You might want to check it out. There's the correlation between Indian Wars. What I was saying is, this article failed to also mention that African Americans are the Aborigines, aka African Americans, are indigenous. A lot of them are, most of us are indigenous here and are Aborigines. And so the Indian War is when a lot of the tribes fought against the U.S., against the military, and to try to fight and keep their land. And so I was thinking too, if you can look back at the Indian Wars and see when they took place and happened, there might be a correlation between the Indian Wars and when your ancestors were put into slavery and the dates. That might be a way you can some kind of way trace which tribe your family member came from. That's if they were captured during that particular time that the war took place. I might be totally off, but I was just thinking maybe sometimes with the wars, I like how they mentioned the Civil War. Sometimes you can trace through the wars. And also, I would think also the Indian Wars, because a lot of the Indians were being captured and thrown into slavery. You might can be able to trace your roots that way too, and maybe stumble across a tribe perhaps. But I think this is really great information right here. And also checking the property records is another great way to see if you can find anything about your ancestors. But let's continue. It says, in addition to the enslaved individuals in 1860, there were also 476,000 free colored persons living in the United States. Like I said, these free colored peoples are Aborigines. They were Indians, more than likely. If your family fell into the category, they should be included by name in many more records. See? And that's another thing you need to check into. Often, a key for success to finding your ancestors in records before this transitional period is to locate the names of those who own your enslaved ancestors. Knowing owners' names can focus on your search on specific records of that family, which can also include information about your family. Here are some records to look for in important periods that can help you understand your ancestors' lives and possibly help you locate the names of your of their owners, so you can push their lines back further. See, I think this is quite interesting. See, they give you some more sources where you can look. It says here the 1870 U.S. Census. You can get the U.S. Census online, and I think it goes further back. You can either go further back in the 1700s. You might can find some information as well. That might pinpoint your ancestors. Another one is the 1867 voter registry. Another one is the Freedmen's Bureau and Freedmen's Bank records. That's very important. People need to look into that. And the records of United States colored troops, USCT, in the Civil Wars. Wow, that's interesting too. I never thought of that. And they have links here, which is awesome. With the Freedmen's Bank, you can see if any of your relatives are listed there. I think Dane Calloway mentions this as well in his in one of his videos, on several of his videos about the Freedmen's Bureau and the Freedmen's Bank records. Very important information. And then, of course, they go into before the war. It says here, before attempted research earlier than the Civil War, make sure you have gleaned all details that you can from the transitional records. Tracing enslaved ancestors prior to the Civil War often requires you to explore new types of records. Census records, which theoretically moves from only including head of households in the 1840s to including every name starting in 1850. Oh, okay. So they used to only put the head of household before then. That's some critical information to know. Did not record names of those enslaved. Oh, wow. It says in 1840s include every name starting in 1850. Did not include names of those enslaved. So they didn't include the slaves. Wow. Even slave schedules kept with the 1850s and 1860 census typically only include information on enslaved individuals by gender and age, although there are a few exceptions. And it says, see how I decoded records for more information. So here it is. This is more resources right here. I didn't click on it, but some more articles. This website is a wealth of information. Has different links here that has more articles, more resources that you can look into to get more information about tracing your roots. And it says here, when searching for information prior to the Civil War, your ancestors would typically be linked with information on their owners. If they were enslaved records from this time period, there are likely a list of information about slaves included. And these are the things that's included in these records. Wills and probable records of slave owners, okay, deed records, plantation records, other local records, okay. And I think the other local records is some areas name of enslaved individuals including other records such as tax records, vital records. These records vary by time and place. Okay, for more details, on finding and using the records, see family search. And so they go into it. They got a little guide here as well. I'm not sure you have to pay for it or not, but it's a little guide here that you can go to give you more information. This is a treasure trove. And they got even more resources here. It says the National Archives. It says the National Archives African American Search. They got the Family Tree Magazine and Family Search link right down here below. So y'all might want to check this out to help with your family research.